All right. Well, we've looked at the imitative character of art, and one of the things that we saw was that within this imitative character, there's an element of expression that occurs because of the participation within the spiritual vitality of the art and the creative imagination that's involved. But in saying this, in saying that there's this dimension of expression, we're still not quite clear on what this means. A lot of times when people talk about art as expression, certainly we've seen this in terms of our class, we get the idea that it's a kind of communication. I want to say something. I want to put something out there. I want to take this inner way of being and put it out for others to know. Now, if that's what you mean by expression, that expression is a little like a word, or maybe like a glyph, a symbol, something like that, Deutsch is going to say that's not quite enough. And it's not quite enough because if that were the case, it would mean that art wouldn't be able to stand on its own. And yet one of the things that we were trying to see with this, especially with this whole element of spiritual vitality I was talking about a little earlier, is that in order for art to be art, there's a way in which there has to be a kind of internal rightness to it, that there has to be an effective power to the art that doesn't just depend upon the observer taking it in a certain way. Art isn't art just because I decide it's going to be art. There's something about the way in which it seems to have a rightness to it, and it's the rightness in it that makes that the part of it. Now, I'm not saying that rightness is entirely independent. Clearly, it needs human beings and culture, minds and souls to unlock it, to engage it, just like in order for a person to be known, there have to be people coming to know who that person is, right? So it is with the art. But it is to say that it's not enough to say that art is simply a kind of putting an idea out there in that kind of expression. It's not just putting a feeling out or putting a concept out. It does have this quality of representation, of putting forward. But when it does so with an inherent rightness that stands on its own in terms of what's being held there. Maybe one of the best ways to see how and why this is the case is to think about how important a work of art is to the artist. Now, I'm not saying that a work of art is important all the time. Certainly, a lot of artists make things that are just, they've slapdashed them together and put them together. But, we saw this with Kant, and I think Deutsch would more or less agree with this. There's certainly a distinction to be made between craft and art. When an artist really makes a work of art, there's a way in which they put themselves into it in a way that they don't necessarily with the craft. There's a way in which they're participating in the rightness of this thing, right? With the creative imagination that we were talking about before, trying to bring this together. And insofar as they're doing that, they are articulating what this rightness is. There's a sense in which the art and the artist become interdependent with one another. Kind of in the way in which, and I don't mean on equal terms, I don't mean if you destroy the work of art, you destroy the artist, but they're interdependent more in the way that, maybe in the way that the words of a speaker are dependent upon the speaker, and the speaker in turn is dependent upon those words in order to be a speaker. She's not dependent upon the words in order to be who she is. But if she's going to be a speaker, she needs the words that she speaks in order to be a speaker, right? Seems straightforward enough. You got no words, you're not a speaker. Well, in the same sort of way, you got no art, you're not an artist. In order for the artist to do this act of creative participation, to do this act where creative imagination comes and represents and brings forth this possibility of expression, they got to be in it. They got to be part of the sustaining of that vital rightness of that thing, right? And in this sense, there's another thing that Deutsch brings up too. Art is not just an expression in the sense that it's the artist putting forward this vital rightness in the thing. In addition, that putting forth is a kind of process. Art is the process of its own being for Deutsch. It is something that in being what it is, it generates its own sense of rightness, its own sense of beauty. What's a way of thinking about this? Well, think about a work of art that's moved you. You know, think about a poem that means something to you, or a painting, or a piece of music, and the things that have a rightness to you. I would bet that there is a way in which their importance isn't something that's just there. You go, wow, I really like that. That's it, and it's the same always. What makes it important is that its meaning seems to unfold, shift, it changes, right? That there's a sense in which the emotional expression of what's there is what it is because it's part of an unfolding process. Kind of like the way in which you speak. Speaking doesn't get done all at once. Speaking takes time, and you can't understand what's said until you listen to the entire speech over this time. Well, you can't understand a work of art until you let the whole of the work of art, both in terms of its creation and in terms of its observation, unfold. Art is, in other words, always revealing itself as it's being art. That's what makes a great work of art a great work of art, is that there's a way in which it's a kind of evolution in and of itself, an evolution of its own brightness, of its own creative expression. So, we have this idea of art as representation, saying first that while it's or its expression, and first that while it's an expression, it's not just putting something out there, it's something that has its own rightness. That this rightness comes from the fact that the artist is participating in that rightness, bringing himself or herself to it in making that creation. That participation and that creation and the being of the art is a process itself, right? It's a becoming. That's what makes the nature of the art. And finally, and I think this is maybe the most important thing for Deutsch with regard to expression, is that he wants to say that what makes the work of art, what makes the expression of a work of art important is that the expression is its own reality. So that I'm not, when I make a work of art, I'm not just making a sign that indicates or points to something. It's not just telling me, feel this way, do this thing. That's not a work of art. That's an indicator of some sort. What makes a work of art is that there is an emotional reality that is unique and integrated and dignified and stands in its own rightness as an expression, and that is its reality. And we come to participate in that both as observers and also as artists, as makers, as creators, and that's what makes that art. It's its own freestanding reality of an emotional way of being. So this is the expression that we have with it. And I guess I would end with this. It's because of this basic reality of art that what makes art real is that it is this freestanding element of emotionality in its own internal rightness that makes it what its art is. It's that gives art its autonomy. It's that which gives art its beauty. It gives art its autonomy in the sense that it gives art a way of standing by its own laws. Here's what I mean. We've actually seen a bit of this. We saw this with discussions about tragedy and in some of the essays that we were reading. there's ways in which if there plenty of things that you read in about in art or that or you encounter in art, all sorts of forms of art that are disturbing, are maybe terrifying, um, can be depressing. They can take you in all these different dimensions. And a lot of times people will say, well, why did you even want to do that? I mean, it's not really all that pleasant. One of the things I think Deutsch, and he's not alone with this, but what Deutsch is trying to get at with that is to say, well, it's not that this art is something that has to exist in and of itself just to please us. It's that it shows us a way of being that we can kind of come to and participate in and understand, often in a way that we can't understand in ourselves. Um, I know in my own experiences with these things, I particularly enjoy poetry. And one of the reasons I like poetry is because it allows me to come to a way of being with emotions um, that it's hard to be able to get to on your own. Not because it's hard psychologically to get to it. I guess sometimes that might be true, but just because it's hard to be able to get an objective stance on it. But poetry can create this sort of objectification of emotion without making it clinical, without making it something that you would put down in a book. It puts something forward in a way where you can hold it and regard it in your mind's eye and in your heart and your soul and go, yeah, I see what this way of being is. I know this aspect inside of myself. I see how this plays out. This is informative. In the best of all worlds, it helps us realize our possibilities. I think that it's this autonomy of expression in art, the way in which art can sort of hold together its own rightness, even things that are really very tragic or terrible or difficult, that can play a very basic part in us coming to fully be the human beings that we can be. It helps us realize a kind of, maybe in the best of all things, a kind of spiritual freedom, because it helps us regard and engage with aspects of what we are, uh, as spiritual beings, as conceptual beings, um, that we wouldn't be able to get to just by going through in this body, with these experiences and reacting to things. So, this is one of the things about art. Um, is autonomy and the importance of autonomy. I guess the other thing I would bring up with regard to this expression as being the emotional rightness that stands on its own is it's inside of that you find the beauty of art. I mean, yeah, art can be pretty, art can be stimulating, art can be titillating, art can be all sorts of these different things, and it cannot be too. But when it's truly beautiful, when it moves, a lot of times it ain't any of those things. A lot of times a beautiful work of art isn't pretty, right? It isn't titillating. It isn't stimulating. It can be very plain. It can be very ordinary. It can be very mundane. You look at Zen ink wash paintings. These things I think are quite beautiful, and yet they can be five strokes of five black lines made with these broad brush bamboo strokes uh, on a sheet of white cloth, and that's beautiful. But yeah, it is, but not because it's pretty. It's because it has a kind of rightness, a way of being that you can bring yourself to engage. And from knowing how to be present to that autonomous expression that emerged in this creative imagination of representation, right? With that, you can come to understand something about art, and you can come to find your humanity and indeed a kind of freedom in it. I think that you probably can't find in other things. So there's that. The one last question that we want to bring up with this then is, well, that's great. So how are you going to do that? How is it that you can come to approach art that way? Because it doesn't seem like just because art has this representational dimension, and just because art has this expressive dimension, it doesn't seem that you're necessarily going to be able to get to this autonomous, beautiful integrity and dignity within the work of art. How do you do that? What do you got to do to bring yourself to that? And this brings us to the aesthetic attitude, which I'll talk about next.